Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And this will be chapter 18, part 1 today. Okay. All right. I hope you guys are enjoying this book. We are more than halfway through. Yep, just a little bit halfway through. And thank you so much for sticking with us. If you have a book, you could follow with us there. If not, you could follow with us on the screen here. I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit. In the meantime, you can check out our other book clubs. We have our spiritual book clubs on Monday and health book clubs on Wednesdays. And we also put out a monthly newsletter that you can sign up, check it out. And we have occasional podcasts where we interview interesting people. So you can check that out as well on our website. If you are finding this helpful and you want to support us, consider our merch. We are working on many designs that will be coming out. So check them all out. And if you are local or traveling to the Los Angeles area, come and visit us in person in our healing center. We use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for animals and humans. So check those out. And all those information will be on the website. And you can learn more about the technologies and some of the services that we provide as well. So, and if you have any books that you want us to recommend, for us to read, I'll leave a link in the description box below, and then you can, recommend it. And, if fits our criteria, we'll read it. We'll be more than happy to read it. So any books, whether it's spiritual, health, or financial. Okay, enough of that. All right, let's do it. This is chapter 18, again, part 1. Loaves and Fishes and Civil War. Attempts to stabilize the banking system by political measures, including regulation of fractional reserve ratios and establishing bank failure insurance funds, the failure of all such schemes, the resulting economic conditions that led up to civil war. As detailed in the previous chapter, by 1836, the Hydra-headed monster had been slain, and true to the president's campaign promise, the nation had Jackson and no bank. In April of that year, the administration moved to consolidate its victory and push a series of monetary reforms through Congress. One of these required all banks to cease issuing paper notes under $5. The figure later was increased to $20, and its purpose was to compel the nation to return to the use of gold and silver coin for everyday use, leaving banknotes primarily for large commercial transactions. The White House also announced that in the future, all federal land sales would require full payment in, quote, lawful money, which of course meant precious metal coins. And that footnote was from Otto Scott, The Secret Six, The Fool as Martyr, Volume 3 of the Sacred Fool Quartet, Columbia, South Carolina Foundation for American Education, 1979, page 115. It must be remembered, however, that even though the Bank of the United States was dead, banking was very much alive, and so were Jackson's enemies. Much to the disappointment of the hard money advocates, these measures were not sufficient to usher in the millennium. Not only were they inadequate by themselves, they were soon circumvented by the development of new banking techniques and eventually were dismantled completely by a fickle Congress. The prohibition against banknotes of small denomination deserves special notice. It was an excellent concept, but what the legislators failed to understand, or at least pretended not to understand, was that banks at this time were increasingly dealing with checkbook money, technically called demand deposits. As people gradually became accustomed to this new method of transferring funds, the importance of banknotes declined. Placing a limit on the issuance of banknotes without any restrictions on the creation of demand deposits was an exercise in futility. In 1837, as the Bank of the United States slipped into history, the nation was at the tail end of an economic boom. Professor Rothbard tells us that this expansion and the accompanying inflation had been, quote, fueled by the central bank. That quote was from Rothbard, Mystery, page 211. Total money in circulation had risen by 84% in just 4 years. Then, as inevitable as the setting sun, that portion of the money supply which had been created by fractional reserve banking, in other words, the part which is backed by nothing, began to contract. 16% of all the nation's money totally disappeared in just that first year. Again, men were put out of work, businesses went into bankruptcy, homes and savings were lost. Many banks folded also, but their operators walked away with the spoils. Only the depositors were left holding the empty bag. There were numerous proposals advanced regarding how to infuse stability into the banking system. But then, as now, none of them dealt with the real problem, which was fractional reserve banking itself. As Close observed, these proposals were, quote, each according to a particular theory of how to multiply loaves and fishes, or how to make candy wool. And that quote was from Close, Money and Men, page 184. Since the proposals presented then are identical to the ones being offered today, and since each of them was actually tried, it would seem appropriate to inquire into the actual results of these experiments. Proposal to base money on bank assets. There were 4 schools of thought regarding the multiplication of loaves and fishes. The first of these was that the creation of money should be limited to a ratio of the bank's assets. This was the formula that was tried in the New England states. In Massachusetts, for example, the issuance of banknotes was limited to two times, excuse me, the amount of the bank's capital actually held in the vault. Furthermore, this could not be in the form of paper money, bonds, securities, or other debt instruments. It had to be strictly gold or silver coin. Also, the banks were limited in the number of small denomination banknotes they could issue. And in this, Massachusetts served as the model for Jackson's attempted reform at the federal level. By previous standards, and certainly by the standards that prevail today, this was an exceptionally conservative policy. In fact, even during the previous stress of the War of 1812, when banks were failing by the hundreds across the country, the Massachusetts banks, most of the other New England banks as well, were able to maintain full payment in specie. With the passage of time, however, the limit on banknotes became less important because the banks now were using checkbook money instead. Their paper notes may have been limited to 200% of their capital, but there was no effective limit to the numbers they could ink into people's deposit books. So the fraction in fractional reserve banking began to shrink again. Consequently, the monetary contraction of 1837, quote, was like the scythe over the crop, says Close. The 30 and 32 Massachusetts bank collapsed between that year and 1844. And that footnote was from Close, Money and Man, page 185. The state attempted to patch the system by instituting a network of bank examiners and by increasing the liability of bank stockholders for the lost funds of the depositors. But the underlying problem was still ignored. A new crop of banks then sprang into existence, and a new wave of speculative mania swept through the economy. By 1862, even though the law still limited banknotes to 2 times capital, the banks had created $73,685,000 in total money, including checkbook money. This was supported by base of only $9,595,000 of specie, a reserve of only 13%. Massachusetts had not solved the problem. Proposal to protect deposits with a safety fund. The second theory about how to have stable banking and allow the banks to create money out of nothing was to create, quote, a safety fund. This fund, supported by all the banks, would come to the aid of any member who needed an emergency loan to cover a sudden drain of its reserves. It was the forerunner of today's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and related agencies. The first safety fund was established, The first safety fund was established in New York in 1829. The law required each bank to contribute annually 1/2 of 1% of its capital stock until the total reached 3%. The fund was first put to the test during the crisis of 1837 and was almost swamped. The only thing that saved it was that the state agreed to accept the worthless notes of all the defunct banks as payment for canal tolls. In other words, the taxpayers were compelled to make up the difference. When the fund was exhausted, the solvent banks were punished by being forced to pay for the deficits of the insolvent ones. Naturally, this impelled all banks to act more recklessly. Why not? The upside was that profits would be higher, for a time at least, and the downside was that if recklessness got them into trouble, the safety fund would bail them out. The result was that the system provided a penalty for prudence and an incentive for recklessness, a situation with perfect parallel to that which exists in the banking system today. Gross-Close says, the conservatively managed institutions, lending upon the safer risks, upon which naturally the margins of profit were smaller, found the assessments burdensome and were compelled to embark upon the more speculative business in order to carry the charges. And that was from Gross-Close, Money and Man. Page 186. Gradually, all banks sank into the quagmire, and in 1857, the Massachusetts Safety Fund was abandoned. Michigan's experience with a safety fund was perhaps more typical of the period. It was established in 1836 and was completely blown away the next year during the Panic of 1837. Proposal to base money on securities. The third proposal for maintaining a stable monetary system, while at the same time allowing the banks to operate fraudulently, was to base the money supply on government securities. In other words, upon paper certificates of government debt. This was the scheme adopted in the 1850s by Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and other Midwestern states. It also set the precedent for the Federal Reserve System 60 years later. Gross-Close continues. So rampant was the note issue mania that the notes came to be called by the appropriate name of Red Dog and Wildcat currency. The rising crop of banks created a fictitious demand and a rising market for securities to be used as capital stock, and a consequent stimulus to the creation of public debt by the issue of securities. This was followed by more banknotes being issued against the securities, demand increasing and the market rising, more security issues, more banknotes, and so on in an endless chain of debt creation and the inflation of paper wealth. The process was finally brought to a stop by the Panic of 1857. And that quote was from Gross-Close, Money and Man, page 188, 189. Okay. Proposal to back money with state credit. The fourth proposal for producing something out of nothing was to back the issuance of money by the full faith and credit of the state. This was the method tried by many of the southern states, and it too has survived to become one of the cornerstones of our modern-day banking system. Alabama, for example, in 1835 created a state bank funded by a public bond issue of $13,800,000. Instant money flooded through the economy, and people were joyous over the miracle prosperity. The legislators were so intoxicated with the scheme that they completely abolished direct taxation and decided to run the government on bank money instead. In other words, instead of raising state revenue through taxes, they found it easier to raise it through inflation. Excuse me. Like all the others, this bubble also burst in the panic of 1837. A post-mortem examination of the bank showed that $6 million of its assets were completely worthless. The people who had lent their real money to the venture, backed by the full faith and credit of the state, lost almost all of their investments, in addition to what they had paid through inflation. Mississippi put its full faith and credit behind a state bank in 1838 and issued $15 million in bonds as backing for its banknotes. The bank was belly up within 4 years, and the state completely repudiated its obligations on the bonds. This infuriated the bondholders, particularly the British financiers who had purchased a large portion of the issue. The devastating effect upon the state and its people is described by Henry Poor. Wow, what a name, Poor. The $48 million of the bank's loans were never paid. The $23 million of notes and deposits were never redeemed. The whole system fell, a huge and shapeless wreck, leaving the people of the state very much as they came into the world. Everybody was in debt without any possible means of payment. Lands became worthless for the reason that no one had any money to pay for them. Such numbers of people fled from the state that the common return upon legal processes against debtors was in the very abbreviated form, GTT, gone to Texas. And that quote was from Henry V. Poor, Money and Its Laws. London, Henry S. King and Company, 1877, page 540. Money based on the full faith and credit of the state met similar fates in Illinois, Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee, and Louisiana. When the state bank collapsed in Illinois in 1825, all of the full faith banknotes left in its possession were ceremoniously burned at the public square. Another bank was formed in 1835 and collapsed in 1842. So devastating were these experiences that the Illinois Constitution of 1848 stipulated that henceforth the state should never again create a bank or own banking stock. In Arkansas, even real estate was tied as a magic wand. Subscribers to the state bank, instead of putting up cash, were allowed merely to pledge their real estate holdings as collateral. The banknotes rapidly plummeted in value to only 25% of their face amount, and within 4 years, the bank was gone. The mirage of free banking. There was a parallel development at this time called free banking. The name is an insult to truth. What was called free banking was merely the conversion of banks from corporations to private associations. Aside from no longer receiving a charter from the state, practically every other aspect of the system remained the same, including a multitude of government controls, regulations, supports, and other blocks against the free market. George Selgin reminds us that, quote, permission to set up a bank was usually accompanied by numerous restrictions, including especially required loans to the state. And that quote was from George A. Selgin, The Theory of Free Banking, Money Supply Under Competitive Note Issue, Totowa, New Jersey, Roman and Littlefield, 1988, page 13. The free banks were no less fraudulent than the chartered banks. The old custom was revived of rushing gold coins from one bank to another, just ahead of the bank examiners, and of, quote, putting a ballast of lead, broken glass, and appropriately 10-penny nails in the box under a thinner covering of gold coins, end quote. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 87. When one such free bank collapsed in Massachusetts, it was discovered that its banknote circulation of $500,000 was backed by exactly $86.48. And that footnote was from Charles Beard, The Rise of American Civilization, New York, Macmillan, 1930, volume 1, page 429, 430. Professor Hans Senholz writes, although economists disagree on many things, most see eye to eye on their acceptance of political control. These economists invariably point at American money and banking before the Civil War, which in their judgment confirms their belief. In particular, they cite the free banking era of 1836 to 1860 as a frightening example of turbulent banking, and therefore applaud the legislation that strengthened the role of government. In reality, the instability experienced during the free banking era was not caused by anything inherent in banking, but resulted from extensive political intervention. Free banking acts did not repeal burdensome statutory provisions and regulatory directives. In fact, they added a few. And that quote was from Old Banking Myths by Hans F. Senholz, The Freeman Irvington on Hudson, New York, May 1989, page 175 to 176. For banking to have been truly free, the states would have had to do only two things. One, enforce banking contracts the same as any other contract. And then two, step out of the picture. By enforcing banking contracts, the executives of any bank which failed to redeem its currency in specie would have been sent to prison, an eventuality which soon would have put a halt to currency overissue. By stepping out of the picture and dropping the pretense of protecting the public with a barrage of rules, regulations, safety funds, and guarantees, people would have realized that it was their responsibility to be cautious and informed. But instead, the banks continued to enjoy the special privilege of suspending payment without punishment, and the politicians clamored to convince the voters that they were taking care of everything. In short, throughout this entire period of bank failures, economic chaos, and fleecing of both investors and taxpayers, America tried everything except full redemption by gold and silver. As the name of Andrew Jackson faded into history, so did the dream of honest banking. Not all banks were corrupt, and certainly not all bankers were conspirators against the public. There were many examples of honest men striving to act in an ethical manner in the discharge of their fiduciary responsibilities, but they were severely hampered by the system within which they labored, a system which, as previously illustrated, punished prudence and rewarded recklessness. In balance, the prudent banker was pushed aside by the mainstream and became but a footnote in the history of that period. Wow, interesting. What an upside down world we live in, huh? The criminals and the dishonest people are rewarded, and the honest people are punished. Wow, that's crazy. That's a bizarro world right there for you. All right, hope you enjoyed that. We will continue part 2 next week. And in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and stay cool out there because it's hot. It's a hot summer. I'll be glad when summer's over. All right, bye-bye now. Have a great day.